The opening few hours of the battle showed a carefully planned and escalating dance that few people could have predicted. Israeli airstrikes hit important military sites all throughout Tehran, including as missile stockpiles, communication hubs, and Navy shipyards. The strikes happened quickly one after the other to make it harder for the Iranian military to control and command its forces. At the same time, Iranian troops fired ballistic and cruise missiles into northern Israel. Drone swarms also moved through the Gulf nations, hitting airfields and radar stations used by U.S. and coalition forces. Because these acts happened at the same time, both sides were reacting not just to what the other side was doing right now, but also to how quickly they thought the dispute was escalating. This generated a feedback loop of action and counteraction that swiftly spread the conflict to a larger area. Within hours, U.S. assets in the area went from being a deterrent to being actively involved. Airborne units, carrier strike groups, and Marines stationed ahead began to move to new locations to assist both defensive and possible offensive operations. This showed that they were willing to directly affect events rather than just watch them happen. This change in position changed the way things worked, not just for Israel and Iran, but also for other countries. The rapid arrival of U.S. troops created new points of strategic pressure across the area. The airspace over the Persian Gulf and Eastern Mediterranean became very crowded, forcing commercial flights and maritime lanes to change course. At the same time, military strategists on all sides had to think about what each new strike could mean. The limits between defensive stance and preemptive maneuver became less clear, showing the first sign of a structural break in regional stability. Civilian areas, which had long been thought to be outside of military goals, were not spared. In Tehran, precision-guided munitions damaged homes near military targets, and rescue personnel had a hard time getting to the scene because of secondary explosions and fires. Israeli border towns had missile alarms that came and went, which led to mass evacuations and showed how weak urban infrastructure is when there is a lot of fighting. Gulf states that host U.S. troops, such Kuwait and Bahrain, reported drone intrusions and small explosions at military bases. This made people more aware that the conflict was going on in more places than just the Iranian-Israeli front. The quick spread of conflict into cities and other populated areas turned strategic plans into real-life effects on people, showing how infrastructure and civilians became part of the operational theater. The operating tempo made it so that there was always something going on. Every launch, interception, or strike opened new ways to respond. Every action sent shockwaves through the air, sea, and land. Command centers kept an eye on radar signatures, satellite feeds, and electronic communications to figure out what the next move would be. However, the speed at which missiles were launched and drones were coordinated always made it hard for even the most advanced detection networks to keep up. This constant pressure kept decision-makers in a state of constant recalibration, assessing the immediate tactical advantage against the risk of uncontrolled escalation. People who were watching said that in these kinds of situations, controlling the course of war isn't only about having a lot of military force, it's also about being able to read and predict how the enemy would act when they're under duress. Despite the obvious shock of the strikes, the war began to show its deeper structure. It was not only a war in the traditional sense, but a web of simultaneous operations, political messaging, and strategic positioning. Every strike was part of a bigger story about deterrence, coercion, and influence. Every civilian death, missile launch, and air raid was both a tactical result and a way to send a message to both enemies and friends. The speed and size of the operations showed that no one person was in complete control. Instead, the war's course was mostly determined by the interaction of military assets, regional relationships, and strategic messaging. As the first wave of violence went on, it became more and more clear that the battlefield was as much about perception and positioning as it was about physical territory. The earliest signs of diplomatic fallout from the crisis came almost right away. hidden beneath the carnage, but nonetheless impacting the larger story of how things got worse. Washington's 15-point proposal, sent through Pakistani intermediaries, tried to set up a framework for de-escalation that included conditional concessions on sanctions relief, nuclear constraints, and security guarantees for the area. It looked like a planned effort to stop the fighting on paper, but the fact that the demands were not equal, tying Iran's operational independence to U.S.-defined benchmarks, showed that the balance of power was not right. Tehran's public stance, which went back and forth between formal review and outright rejection, was a planned show aimed to establish sovereignty while leaving possibility for negotiation or delay. Analysts who looked at the comments saw that they were purposely vague, which showed that the person was resisting outside demands without closing off any possible diplomatic paths right away. It rapidly became clear that there was a gap between what was said and what was done. U.S. officials said talks may happen soon, but Iranian officials said there was no chance of real negotiations and called the proposal too much and coercive. This two-story story gave both countries a chance to stay strong while also testing how people in the region and throughout the world would react. The semi-official media in Iran focused on the requirements that would have to be met for hostilities to stop, an end to what Tehran called aggression, compensation for damage, guarantees against fresh sanctions, and recognition of its control over the Strait of Hormuz. These rules were intentionally broad, creating a legal and political framework that would make any immediate U.S. proposal more difficult and put intermediary governments in a difficult position. Regional players used their own math to deal with these unclear situations. Pakistan had to deal with Tehran's contradictory signals while still being credible with Washington after delivering the U.S. plan. Turkey, which was also mentioned as a possible place for talks, used its role as a middleman to increase its influence in the region. This shows how domestic and geopolitical objectives are always linked to multilateral involvement. The acts of each country showed how fragile the balance was between legal requirements, diplomatic signals, and strategic positioning. The 15-point framework was supposed to be a way for the two sides to talk to each other, but it had really become a way to test the larger regional order. Compliance, resistance, and interpretation all had effects that went beyond the two sides' talks. The legal and political effects of the conflict began to become clear in international forums. The UN Security Council held emergency meetings to look into possible violations of international law, such as attacks on civilian infrastructure and the fairness of strikes. Secretary General Antonio Guterres called the escalation a crisis of governance and legal constraint. He stressed that Lebanon and other countries must not become proxy for a long-term conflict. At the same time, Western European powers began talks to guarantee marine routes via the Strait of Hormuz. This created a layered system of military diplomacy that made it hard to tell the difference between enforcement, deterrence, and cooperative governance. As a result, legal frameworks were always being tested against the realities of kinetic action, which caused problems between formal international law and operational necessity. In the middle of these overlapping stories, the idea of diplomacy itself became a point of contention. What had formerly been a tool for managing and settling disputes was now caught up in the same forces that were making the battlefield worse. Strategic ambiguity, selective transparency, and calibrated messaging were used to mold people's opinions as well as to move policy goals forward. Political pressure grew stronger not only across borders, but also within the organizations that were supposed to mediate them, such the UN. It was hard for committees, coalition planning cells, and intermediary nations to stabilize a war that wouldn't stay contained in the usual ways. The weakness of these diplomatic structures highlighted a larger structural truth. When war is both action, message, and leverage, the tools meant to stop it from getting worse can themselves become sources of pressure, increasing uncertainty and making room for more problems. By the third day of fighting, the operational and diplomatic sides of the dispute started to come together, showing a network of systemic strain instead of just individual clashes. The United Nations, through quick briefings and pronouncements from Secretary General Antonio Guterres, made it clear that the recurring conflicts were signs of structural failure, not just tactical mistakes. Instead of portraying the situation as a negotiated crisis, institutional language focused on the hazards that could happen, such as the breakdown of command structures, the weakness of civilian protections, and the exposure of vital infrastructure. International observers said that each event, whether it was a missile strike in northern Israel or a drone attack on a Gulf airbase, put strain not only on the people involved, but also on the systems that govern the world, showing where the regional security system is weak. This framing changed how people thought about the conflict, making it seem like a multidimensional disturbance that had effects on the legitimacy of institutions and the oversight of operations. At the same time, military coalitions started to quietly mobilize, which showed both caution and readiness. European naval forces, commanded by the UK and France, held technical coordination meetings to protect transport lanes and keep tensions from rising along commercial shipping routes in the Strait of Hormuz. These actions were described in defensive terms, but their quick execution and wide scope made it clear that they were ready to use force if necessary. NATO members and its allies did air and naval drills in the eastern Mediterranean at the same time to test interoperability and send strong deterrent signals. This kind of proactive stance achieved two purposes. It gave regional partners confidence in their pledges to collective security and limited the strategic options of hostile players. The overall effect of these maneuvers was to speed up operations in the areas surrounding active conflict zones, which effectively increased the chances of escalation without a formal declaration of broader engagement. The United States, in particular, turned its deterrent postures into operational readiness. Airborne brigades and Marine expeditionary formations were added to the forward-deployed formations in Kuwait, Bahrain, and Qatar. This set up rapid response capabilities across various vectors. The difference between defensive deployment and actionable escalation started to fade. Strategic planners had set up a system where pre-positioned forces could be used for either crisis containment or direct confrontation at the last minute. This change added a new element to the war. The deployment of large mobile U.S. forces changed the theater from a two-sided battle to a multi-nodal engagement system. Commanders had to think about not just what Iran and Israel were doing, but also what the U.S. may do in the future, which made things much more complicated and unknown from a strategic point of view. At the same time, militias and non-state players that were on Iran's side started to get involved in the conflict, making an already unstable situation much more so. Groups in Lebanon, Syria, and Yemen that had previously been on the sidelines of direct conflict began to plan strikes, reconnaissance, and logistical support in line with Tehran's strategic goals. These people didn't follow the usual norms of engagement, and their involvement made the theater bigger in both space and operations. Adding these networks made chains of command that crossed each other and areas of authority that were up for grabs. This made both military planning and intelligence evaluation harder. Every new actor made the concentration of control even less solid, showing how a war that was no longer linear or hierarchical, but networked, dynamic, and fundamentally unstable, was developing. As more people became involved, the war changed from a series of events to a system of interconnected escalation nodes. Every military move, political signal, or strategic deployment affected many levels of operational and institutional feedback, making it harder to see how things were connected. When diplomatic talks did happen, they were limited not just by animosity between the two sides, but also by the structural demands from many stakeholders and military campaigns happening at the same time. Because actions were so closely linked, one small event might set off a chain reaction that affected policy decisions, operational planning, and regional security postures all at the same time. In this setting, the war stopped being a normal war and turned into a networked escalation system with no clear boundaries. Control was spread out among many people, institutions, and feedback loops, and every choice had bigger effects on the whole region. As the war turned from tactical battles to a long-term regional crisis, financial markets were less affected by individual strikes and more by the underlying structural instability that now ruled the Persian Gulf. The Strait of Hormuz, which carries about a fifth of the world's oil and liquefied natural gas, became a flashpoint. Uncertainty about its accessibility quickly spread through global energy markets. Tanker traffic was stopped, diverted, or delayed, which caused insurers to raise rates dramatically and logistics companies to look for other ways to get their goods to market. This showed weaknesses in supply chains that were thought to be strong. In the early trading sessions, crude oil futures rose sharply, while stocks in Asia and Europe were more volatile. This was because investors thought that disruptions could spread well beyond the area of conflict. Analysts stressed that these changes were signs of a market reassessing structural risk rather than reacting to specific military actions. They also noted that these changes could have consequences on commodities, currency, and financial markets. Energy infrastructure in Iran and nearby Gulf states became an important factor in global economic calculations. Attacks on refineries, pipelines, and shipping terminals not only hurt local production, but also had impacts on countries that rely on imports, compelling them to use strategic reserves and emergency measures. Countries that relied heavily on Gulf energy supplies started changing how they bought energy, looking for other sources in North America, Africa, and Asia. However, the sudden scope of the transition caused logistical and contractual expenses that couldn't be immediately reduced. Insurance markets, which were already under a lot of stress because of global crises, changed rates in real time to reflect the higher risk of naval operations in disputed waters. These cascading consequences showed how geopolitical stability and the global economy depend on each other. They also showed that even conflicts in one region can cause systemic problems in tightly linked worldwide supply networks. The way investors acted showed the change from tactical response to strategic recalibration. Fund managers and sovereign wealth accounts made a clear trend toward defensive assets. Safe haven currencies, government bonds, and energy futures hedges were the main tools for reducing risk. The stock markets, especially in sectors that are affected by energy, transportation, and infrastructure, saw more ups and downs. Algorithmic trading made reactions to real-time reports from the battle zone much stronger. The quick changes to portfolios showed that people were not only worried about short-term losses, but also that the conflict may go on for a long time, which would make international trade, capital flows, and business operations unclear for a long time. This protective stance showed that the market was becoming more aware of structural weakness than individual events, just as the feedback loops seen on the operational battlefield. The crisis showed that the system had deeper flaws than just short-term changes in the market. Supply chains that relied on the Gulf for everything from petrochemical feedstocks to consumer goods had to quickly come up with backup plans that had never been tested or improved for these kinds of situations. It was clear how energy supply, transportation insurance, and global trade flows were all connected. This showed how a problem in one location might quickly spread to many others. Analysts said that the global economy has long anticipated that there would be geopolitical stability, especially in countries that produce energy. However, the present war was putting such assumptions of resilience to the test in planning and infrastructure. The structural effects went beyond price spikes and affected strategic stockpiling, risk assessment, and the long-term adjustment of national and business supply strategy. As markets, supply chains, and insurance systems adapted to the changing conflict, people became more conscious that the global system can't handle long-term geopolitical shocks very well. The quick rise in army deployments, missile attacks, and strategic signaling made things very unpredictable all the time, and regular risk management couldn't fix it. Countries that depend on Gulf energy, multinational companies that do business in the region, and international banks all experienced challenges at the same time that strained the limits of strategic foresight. The structural lesson was clear. Localized wars in geopolitically important areas can spread systemic risk around the world, which goes against the ideas of stability that are the basis of today's financial and economic systems. In this light, every fresh strike, Every delayed shipment and every new market position made it more clear that the current battle was not just a regional problem, it was a stress test for the global system as a whole. The war in the Middle East has changed the way we think about power, deterrence, and sovereignty. It has shown that established structures and assumptions may be changed when they are under a lot of stress. States that used to be sure they could project power now have to deal with constant strategic attrition, where short-term gains are short-lived and long-term goals are put off indefinitely. The many fronts, such as Iran's missile attacks, Israeli airstrikes, U.S. troop deployments, and the involvement of aligned militias, show that the structure of war has changed. It has become more complex and fragmented in a way that traditional conflict resolution frameworks can't easily handle. This normalization is part of a larger trend around the world. The lines between domestic, regional, and global domains of influence are becoming less obvious. Each actor is both shaping and being limited by systemic forces that are beyond their direct control. Institutions that have historically been responsible for stabilizing crises, such as the United Nations and regional security coalitions, are now more reactive than authoritative, responding to events after they have already started to spiral out of control instead of preventing them from getting worse in the first place. Their pronouncements, resolutions, and meetings are well planned, but they often come too late to have an effect on what is happening on the ground. This shows that there is a gap between their mandate and their ability to carry it out. People who watch say that relying on post-facto interventions again and over again makes institutions less credible. This tells both state and non-state actors that they can escalate their actions with little systemic restraint. The lack of trust goes beyond what people think. It calls into question the unwritten social contract that supports international governance, which believed that norms, enforcement, and mediation would keep things stable even when things became tough. This battle is another example of how strategic norms are changing. Now, the interdependence of military, political, and economic levers has a bigger effect on outcomes than formal treaties or agreements. Energy choke points, global supply chains, and financial markets are now secondary theaters of impact. Disruption is an instrument of leverage that is as powerful as direct kinetic action. When these dynamics work together, regional conflicts become global ones, and every choice has effects on many levels of the system. Both countries and businesses have to constantly change their risk models, contingency plans, and resource allocation in order to adapt to new situations. So, the battle is no longer limited by borders or short-term goals. Instead, it is part of a bigger system of feedback and anticipatory behavior, where uncertainty itself becomes a constant operational factor. The war could produce irreversible fault lines in the world order in the long run. Repeated cycles of escalation without resolution are calling into question long-held beliefs about deterrence, sovereignty, and the effectiveness of multilateral agreements. Regional players watch how power and influence operate together and learn about the limits of traditional diplomacy and the effectiveness of preemptive, networked, and multi-domain strategies. If these conditions become regular, the world might become a place where there is always conflict, talks are only temporary, and stability is just temporary, instead of being based on something solid. This kind of structural change would be a break from what people thought after World War II about how conflicts would be resolved and who would have authority over global institutions. For Ultimora 24, this means a lot. What looks like a singular, unusual war today could be the model for how we view the geopolitical structure of the 21st century. The war showed us systemic pressures like fragmented power projection, reactive institutions, and the mixing of military and economic areas. These show us a world where permanent fault lines are as important as borders, and where the lack of a clear resolution leads to cycles of strategic tension instead of closure. As analysts, policymakers, and citizens, we still ask ourselves, in a world where everything is connected and fragile, How will governments balance their own sovereignty with their reliance on others? And who is in charge of the lines between conflict and control? Will this battle set a bad example for future crises? Or will new ways of adapting come up to bring stability back to a world that has changed?